Hello, we are now in Guardini's book, The Lord, part 5, which is entitled The Last Days. So we're looking at the last days of Jesus the Lord in Guardini's book, The Lord. And we're entering into chapter 1, which of course is appropriately entitled The Entry into Jerusalem. So here we are with the event of what we call Palm Sunday, right? And so Guardini's going to take us through this event, and he's going to look at it in terms of prophecy, okay? And he's going to begin his discussion here of prophecy and history, okay? And the role of prophecy. So it's interesting because as he gets to the very core of the account of Christ's passion, he also gets to the core of one of the great themes of these sketches that he's presenting us in his book, The Lord. That is, he wants to deal here with the problem of human history, salvation history, and prophecy. See, he really wants to deal, I think, with the kind of nexus of those things, and not just deal with them like as an academic question, but rather he's dealing with them in the flow of his own experience of his relationship with God as it's revealed to him in the sacred liturgy. See? Remember, so much of Guardini is this feeding on the liturgy, okay? So he's going to do two things. He's going to feed on the liturgy, and then he's going to step back and reflect on prophecy and history. So it's a profound book, isn't it? So here's the entry into Jerusalem. In Bethphage, on a place on the Mount of Olivet, which they pass on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus sends the disciples ahead with a curious order. They're to go to the marketplace, unbind an ass and her colt, which they will find there, and bring them to him. Everything is as Jesus describes it. And when the owners protest, the disciples reply as instructed, "The Lord has need of them." And they comply. Now, this was done that what was spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. "Tell the daughter of Zion, behold, thy king comes to thee meek, and seated upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. And they brought the ass and the colt, laid their cloaks on them, and made him sit thereon. And most of the crowd spread their cloaks upon the road, while others were cutting branches from the trees and strewing them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and those that followed kept crying out, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." You hear, of course, the echo of the liturgy here. Okay, very important. Whenever Guardini echoes the liturgy, that should be kind of a sign for us to take note, because we too enter into this when we hear these passages in the liturgy most profoundly, and then when we're meditating on them personally or privately, they recall the liturgy for us, see? The liturgy is the source of Guardini's very, very fruitful meditations, I think. And when Jesus, entered Jerusalem, all the city was thrown into commotion, saying, "Who is this?" But the crowd kept on saying, "This is Jesus the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee." Well, this event, says Guardini, is prelude to the last 6 days of the Lord's life on earth. To understand it, we must, he says, turn to the scholars of the Old Testament history, who explain that it was customary to accompany pilgrims, particularly those who brought the seasonal first offerings to the temple in joyful procession. So it's a temple procession, according to Guardini, through the city. Moreover, he says, the population had got wind of Jesus' latest miracle, his last miracle, he says, the resurrection of Lazarus. For as St. John tells us, many had made the trip to Bethany just to see the one called back from the death, right? So there you have it. So there's a profound excitement that grips the city. The multitudes flows toward the temple and pours into its sacred precincts. Here the synoptics report the cleansing of the temple, which John describes as part of Jesus' first visit to Jerusalem. Guardini solves that problem, that it could have been, there was more than one cleansing. He says, perhaps it's a second cleansing, for since the abuses continued, any number of sweepings are possible. Okay, so that strikes me as pretty real. Like you can't just get rid of corruption once. You got to keep working at it, right? I mean, sweeping reforms may require a second sweeping. We know that in our own households, right? Invalids gather, and Jesus heals them. And disciples, people from the street, children run through the halls, calling again, Hosanna to the Son of David, which, you know, that's messianic, okay? So it's gonna evoke another reaction, and from the officials, and sure enough. And when the officials accost Jesus and demand to know whether he hears and approves those, in their eyes, blasphemous words, he asks if they have never read the truth that will be revealed by the mouths of infants and sucklings. Luke adds the words of the Pharisees telling him to forbid them. And Jesus' reply, I tell you that if these keep silence, the stones will cry out. Okay? So, the hour, as Guardini explains it, overflows with supernatural power. Okay? In these last days, it is as if Jesus were gathering strength on strength, preparing for the ultimate. He has just summoned Lazarus from the dead. His power has accompanied the disciples into the world, so that their word strangers entrust their flocks to them. See? Now, triumphantly, he enters Jerusalem, fulfilling to the letter the prophecy of the coming Messiah. Now notice this. Until then, he has refused to be called the Messiah and crowned king. Now he proclaims himself the long-awaited one. It's clear enough for all who have eyes to see. There is tremendous excitement, a steadily swelling stream of people, loud with the voices of adults and the cries of children, flows endlessly in the direction of the temple. It can no longer be stopped. Buyers and sellers in the temple are sent flying. The sick are healed. The hostile who ask with what right all this is done are silenced by the impact of the answer. It is a prophetic event, Guardini continues. Prophecy had, this is Guardini, ceased a long time ago. Centuries have passed since Malachi last spoke, like the last of the Old Testament prophets. After that, the voice faded and remained mute until in John, one crying in the desert, John the Baptist, it awakens one last time. Now, he too, John the Baptist, is dead. But the ghost of prophecy rises once more and seizes the multitude, and in the Spirit, the multitude beholds and interprets and acts. Okay? So it's like the Spirit rises up in the multitude, according to Guardini. And the prophetic experience lifts the historical barriers, he says, that hem in ordinary lives. Okay? Living in history, he says, we experience only the present, the immediate. This is as it should be. He says it simplifies decision and directs action. For, he says in parentheses here, in this world only ignorance gives us the freedom necessary to act. End of parentheses. So, you know, our own human experience of history is quite limiting. And one of the things that limits our freedom, big time, is obviously ignorance. Okay? That's stunningly true. Then Guardini goes on. Now he's going to contrast it, I think. Moving in prophecy, the Holy Spirit dissolves all limitations and enables the prophet, from his new unhindered vantage point, to see simultaneously what was, what is, and what is to be. So only the Holy Spirit can do that, okay? So that's the distinction, I think, that's really important. But when the Holy Spirit does that, okay, there's this sort of, what Guardini calls, later on, he'll use the term, that telescoping of time, okay? The way he first describes it, again, is that from a new unhindered vantage point, you see simultaneously what was, what is, and what is to be. And he goes on. For the prophet, as he said, as I'm repeating, time is telescoped. Sometimes I repeat to emphasize the insight that Guardini has there. Standing in the living present, he sees both past and future, for he's already part of eternity. See, by the power of the Holy Spirit. Okay? Living in history, now he's going to contrast it with our experience of just living in history. Our interior life is hidden from one another. And he says, it is impossible to see. Of course it is. That's why one of the reasons we can't assess what's in a heart of a person. Therefore, we have to leave judgment to God. That's the thing I'm thinking about when I read that. It's impossible to see, understand, and grasp the inner life of another, save when it's self-revealed, when somebody actually begins to try to reveal themselves. And actually, it seems to me that self-revelation, to be accurate, needs the strength of the Holy Spirit on top of that, I think. That's just a pastoral side, I think. This is also by the way, for Guardini, this is, this limitation is also well, because for him, it's the foundation of modesty. You're not going to stretch too far to assess other people if you understand that. Modesty and respect. And there's that respect for your fellow human beings that it's hard sometimes for arrogant people to come to, it seems to me, because there's this tendency of human arrogance to be quick to judge and quick to be defensive and quick to do all that. But there's this true modesty if you really understand our place, even our place in history. History should produce true history, produces a sense of wonder and awe and modesty in us. That's why I think it's worth pondering that, okay? You know, and then he says this experience of modesty and ignorance and all that, it enables us to act, to take chances, to participate in the shaping of our destinies. If the inner existence stood open to view, history would be impracticable. For history can play its role only among masked players. In eternity, where souls are transparent, history no longer exists. Human history no longer exists in eternity. Now, the prophet, however, already sees into others, or rather, he even qualifies it more, the Spirit, with a capital S, the Holy Spirit, so places him that he sees things from within. Okay? We see only appearances, their meaning is hidden. Once in a while, their sense blazes out on us briefly, only to re-unfold itself in darkness. Thus, we live in mystery and hope. And the older I get, there's just a lot more mystery and hope. But it's hope. It's hope in the face of what is unseen. Okay? Because that's what hope is. So to the prophet, the meaning of things is revealed. For him, there is no borderline between mystery and revelation. Okay? But here, Guardini says we have to make a distinction. We must make a distinction. There are purely natural gifts of a similar order. Okay? Much that is premature and confused and erroneous has been claimed of, like clairvoyance, okay? But that it exists cannot seriously be denied, okay? This does not mean, however, that it is prophecy. So he's making a very clear distinction here between, like, just somebody kind of willy-nilly telling the future because they're claimed, or they are, as he said, clairvoyant, and what real spiritual biblical prophecy is, okay? He's making that distinction. He says one does not become a prophet by talent, but by the Spirit of God, again, with a capital S. It's summoning to a special service, okay? The prophet is sustained by the salutary will of God, okay? And remember, the salutary will of God is no small thing. That's his desire to save everybody in the world. That's the salutary will of God. So the prophet, the person who is actually a prophet, receives a gift from the Holy Spirit that's connected with God's will to save us. Okay? I think that's really, and it's a special service, according to Guardini. That's worth really looking at. Like, so it starts with God's love and his desire to save us. Okay? And the prophet collaborates with God on his works and on the history resulting from God's works. Knowledge of the future is not what makes the prophet, okay? But his ability to interpret history according to the salutary divine will behind the history, behind it. Proclaiming this will an advance to history in the making. So this is not just telling the future in a clairvoyant way. It's the power given to a person by the grace of the Holy Spirit to understand how it fits together, how history works in accords to God's salutary will. And speaking that loving, salvific will to people in their own history. Prophecy is, this is key, this is one sentence that sums it up here. End of the first partial paragraph on page 364 of our edition. Prophecy is divine revelation of the sense of history. Okay? Prophecy is divine revelation of the sense of history. Guardini continues. It is with such prophecy that we are dealing with here. Okay? Jesus acts, and the same spirit that inspires his action moves in those about him, revealing to them its meaning. Simultaneously, their eyes see the Lord as he rides through the street, and their spirit sees what is behind the event. Okay? And so Guardini is going to really sketch this out for us now in a very memorable passage in this book, I think. So, the physical eye, he continues, and the spiritual are one in the way they see the Lord. Okay? And those who so truly saw, in quotation marks, in that hour were not the particularly talented, neither geniuses, nor in any way the elite or the mighty, but the common people. They're the ones who saw it. Common people in quotation marks. Those who happened to be in the streets at the time. For the power that opened their eyes and hearts was not human power, but the Spirit of God moving among men. Indeed, as the full quotes, the little ones, end of full quotes, possessors of the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus calls them, who are particularly free and open to the workings of the Spirit, with a capital S, for in them it can operate untrammeled by the consciousness of their own human value. Okay? They are the little ones. Okay? This then is God's hour. Were the masses to reject it, the stones beneath their feet would proclaim the Messiah with a capital M. It is the last God-given chance. Oh my. Will those seized by its power also find the strength to act according to the Spirit? That's the question Guardini raises. Will they, after all, force the gates of the kingdom which had seemed so hopelessly barred? Question. He just leaves that open. When we look closely at the figure of the Lord, when we look closely at the figure the Lord cuts as he rides along, and at the people running at his side, and when we imagine ourselves actual witnesses to the scene, okay, so the meditation of place, he's now asking us to do that. Step into that scene on Palm Sunday. And we imagine ourselves there. How true the words of the apostles seem. And he quotes from 1 Corinthians, that famous quote, to the Jews, indeed, a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles, foolishness. Okay? That really is quite a quote. And of course, it's St. Paul looking at the crucified Jesus when he says that. Okay? And Guardini brings that up, okay? And he says, here it is again, the stumbling block, in quotation marks, scandal, quotation marks, that so often reigned instead of love. Scandal and stumbling block reigned instead of love. That's hard to get our heads around sometimes. It had already broken out in Nazareth, he continues. No matter what Jesus said, though he uttered words of divine power and profundity, invariably they were answered with stubbornness, distrust, and hate. Gosh, we see a lot of that. No matter what he did, he healed, helped, he pardoned, he showered people with gifts. His thanks were hardness of heart, calumny, misinterpretations of his motives, and Guardini adds, blasphemy against the Spirit. That's the Holy Spirit with a capital S. That's really scary. Lord, preserve us. Now, again, scandal rears its head. A high tide of enthusiasm floods the temple, washing away indifference, pain, and human suffering. One would suppose that nobody could resist its salutary power, and that the great community of hearts, prerequisite to the founding of God's kingdom on earth, would at last become vital reality. Instead, the Pharisees step in to the fore and demand Jesus' legitimation. Indignant, they ask if he does not hear the blasphemous things his disciples are proclaiming. Why does he not stop the nonsensical shouts of the children? That's what they ask. They are so incapable of feeling the divinity of the hour that after his reply about the stones proclaiming him were the others to be silenced, Jesus turns on his heel and leaves them. And the foolishness onto the Gentiles, Guardini continues, next paragraph. One interpreter writes that it is tempting to compare Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. This is great. This is a high point in Guardini, I think. When he's doing this meditation on place, he imagines this based on another commentator. But this shows why Guardini helps us so much, I think. Think of this. One interpreter writes that it is tempting to compare Jesus' entry into Jerusalem with the triumphal marches glittering with pomp and ceremony as we knew them from the pages of Roman history. Jesus, too, is a victorious sovereign. Absolutely. His power is apparent to all. Cheering crowds surge toward the omnipotent one, and the breath of divinity is in the air. And yes, suppose a high-ranking Roman officer in shining armor had trotted by just then on his blooded mount, his orderly troop behind him, a fragment of that great army which bore the power of Rome across the world. This guy from Rome, travels by this procession in Jerusalem. What would he have thought? Asked Guardini. Had he seen the poorly dressed man on his donkey? A coat as a saddle? The heterogeneous crowd about him? This is what Guardini says. The thought hurts. But that is how it was. The thought hurts. But that is how it was. When we're reading Guardini, he helps us see how the thought that we come across in our encounters with the gospel can hurt. But it's reality. Okay. This then is how it is when God descends to men. The apparent folly and danger of it are so great that the just and orthodox prepare for legal condemnation. The event is not even clothed in the dignity of genuine poverty. That would have also been impressive, for side by side with the power of greatness, there exists the moving or august power of poverty, which stirs by its own mysterious power. But it is not genuine poverty that accompanies Jesus, neither among his disciples, nor in the cheering masses. It's simply the average crowd, as it is to be found everywhere, in workshop, store, and street. When I was doing the discussion groups, I said, well, just think about walking into a Walmart or another store like that. That's a crowd in which we all could find our place. You know, human reality, mediocrity, you know, bare of the pathos, both of splendor and of misery. That's the kind of crowd we're talking about. And Guardini finishes this consideration by saying how difficult it is to recognize the self-revealing God. How difficult to steer clear of the scandal to the worldly sense of propriety and righteousness. It is. God's going to come to us often in the most ordinary of circumstances. And often we pass him by. Help us to use our appreciation of Guardini and the Gospels to grow in faith, hope, and love. Thank you very much.